Enotria, the last song's a pretty complex RPGs. You've got masks and mask lines and mask perks and aspects and 3 different loadouts and a massive world to explore. And there are plenty of mistakes that I made and things that I just honestly didn't understand until I figured it out. So let me explain everything that you need to know. Let's go. Let me know any tips that I've missed in the comments down below. We'll start with Virtue, which is just like your attributes in its simplest form. Now, there's a lot of things here that when you're looking at this like a level up screen and the descriptions that each of these attributes explain to you don't totally like explain exactly what that effect does. It doesn't help you make a decision here, right? We'll briefly go through each of these and talk about what they are. So the Bruiser is your basic one here that improves your overall health and just like your overall defense. Assassin is the main damage dealing attribute. So this improves your damage dealt with physical attacks as well as increase your luck, so the chance of enemies dropping items. Elementalist improves your elemental damage dealt with weapons and certain mask lines as well. More on elemental stuff later. And the Trickster increases your stamina and pouch size, so the more things you can carry. And then Battle Mage is all focused on those mask lines, so increasing the speed of those mask lines, essentially spells, as well as the damage and any Adua related abilities and equipment. Now, in the initial stages of the game, I would recommend to focus on Bruiser to increase your max health, and then Assassin, which is just straight attack power, so basic physical damage, as all of like the weapon attacks will do physical attack power damage to some degree, and then it will expand into say elemental damage or something like that if you're going that route. But they're the first two I would focus on, and then maybe Trickster to increase your stamina, and then if you are going to focus on being some sort of elementalist, then focusing on that line. Something that I did, which I don't recommend, is to ignore the elementalist line, because I was like, I'm not going to do any elemental damage, like I won't worry about that. But there is a ton of amazing weapons that require the elementalist attribute. Like you can actually see in the loadout screen, by the way, if you tab across to the next screen, you'll be able to see what the requirements are to actually use that weapon. So many of the best weapons in the game are requiring elemental, so would definitely recommend to level up the elementalist attribute at least a little bit. And then it really helps because of the sort of the rock paper scissors of the different elemental damage types in the game will really help your success later on when you're fighting enemies that are like resistant to certain effects and really weak against certain other ones. It does really make a difference to chipping away at their big health bars. Now you can reset your virtues later in the game, so don't stress too much if you make a bad call like in the early game, but you will have to wait a little while until that does become available to you. So speaking of those elements, they are super critical to actually get right. Now you will come across enemies throughout the game, like the entire game, that are either immune to certain elemental effects, will deal certain elemental effects or status damage to you, and then they're all vulnerable to other ones. Now the sort of the rock paper scissors, even though there's 4 of them, like breakdown of this is kind of unclear in the game. That little icon you see at like the top left is actually kind of trying to explain it to you, so you've always got it on hand. Something to note here is that it actually goes anti-clockwise, not clockwise. Like my brain took forever to figure that out. But so to explain each of these effects to you, the Vascio defense that you see on enemies, they are vulnerable to Gratia or radiant damage. When you are affected by the radiant status effect, you will heal over time, but that effect can be popped to create like an explosion. It can also be popped on enemies as well to create an explosion there. If enemies have Viz defense, they are vulnerable to the Vascio status that we just talked about. Viz can apply Dizzy. Now Dizzy increases the amount of damage dealt as well as stamina recovery, but it also lowers your defenses, so you'll take more damage, same with enemies when they're affected by that status effect. The Malona defense is vulnerable to Viz, and Malona does inflict Sick, which it gives you a damage over time effect. Now this can spread to you and enemies when someone is affected by it. And the Gracio defense is vulnerable to Malona that we just touched on as well. Balancing and understanding these status effects will take time. I personally don't even know that if I totally get them yet, because they are kind of complex, but there is a difference between the elemental damage it does as well as the status effect that it does apply. So totally would recommend to just tinker with these different weapons. And speaking of weapons, you need to be using all 3 loadouts. There is a reason that you have 3 as well. Primarily, the reason I have found is because of these elemental effects, right? So what I've done is I've got my main loadout on 1, which is like my pure like deflect build, like not leaning into any status effects. And then on loadout 2 and 3, I've got weapons that cover all 4 status effects, so I can use that to define on enemies like, all right, is this enemy weak to this? Is this enemy weak to this? Like using those for those specific scenarios. And then when I'm not leaning into those status effects, I'm just using like my main effect on 1. Now in those loadouts, you can change everything from the mask you have equipped, your mask lines, all the Path of Innovator skills as well, which I did have a video that went out yesterday talking about those skills, so I'll link that here if you want to know more about that. that stuff. But we'll move on to the weapon skills themselves. Now, something I didn't realize is that there are weapons that will have increased elemental damage, but they won't be highlighted like some other weapons, and they won't apply a status effect. What this means is that those weapons, when you use a weapon attack or like a weapon skill, they will actually apply that status effect and that elemental damage. Now, weapon attacks aren't just like your basic light attack combos, they're actually on your heavy attack. Now, this can be weaved in between your light attacks, or you can actually just like charge up like a heavy attack and it will apply that elemental damage as well as that status effect. Some of these weapons are some of like the best ones to use in the game, especially making sure that you are matching up those element types with the weaknesses like we touched on earlier. But a lot of the weapons will have these unique effects or unique attack combos. So would definitely recommend to test any of the gear that you do pick up, right? Like even if one of your loadouts is simply there just to like play around and like tinker with weapons, then just switch over to that, tinker with new stuff that you get, see what it actually does and see if it's beneficial to you, as there's plenty of weapons that you'll pick up in this game that are actually quite more unique than just looking at them and like, oh, I've just got another longsword, you know, like they are actually quite different in terms of the way they operate. The game just doesn't explain that very well in the descriptions when you're just like looking at it. Now, speaking of these weapons and trying out different ones, you can refund the cost of upgrading any of your equipment from your masks, your mask lines, or your weapons. Now, refunding will give you that material back. It doesn't give you the memora or the runes back. A good example is if you're in the second area of the game where you're fighting a lot of enemies that are weak to radiant damage and you're using the blessed rapier here, right? Then if you get to the third area or like the second map of the game, right? Those enemies aren't going to be weak to the Gratia and the radiant damage. So you might want to refund that weapon's materials and put that into something else that they might be weak to. Tinkering with these weapons and like moving these materials like back and forth is something I've done throughout the game to make sure that whatever weapon is my main weapon at that time for a specific boss is maxed out as much as possible, and then switching that to something else if I'm using it for something else for some other encounter. Now, I would also recommend to return to the hub area quite regularly. To unlock this, you'll need to defeat Zany in the first area of the game, and then past that location is where you'll actually find the Theater of Masks. Now, here you'll have NPCs, and after certain like milestones throughout the game, more people will show up here to talk to as well. But the main reason to go here is because there is like one of the only vendors in the game is here. They sell some fantastic stuff, not only in terms of like items, but they sell weapons and different deflect crystals and other things as well. The one thing that I would buy from them constantly is the ammonia sap. Now this costs 50 runes, so it's super cheap. Essentially it gives you the bloodborne heal mechanic for a period of time. I would buy an absolute ton of these because if you run out of healing flasks, you've got this to lean back on. You can quickly pop this, and then by dealing damage, you'll get some health back, right? I would also return to this guy pretty often once you've completed certain milestones and like major bosses, as his inventory in terms of the weapons and stuff that they do sell does actually change. So make sure you're checking back here and seeing what new things he has available to you to buy. The Adua Burst is one thing that I was not using outside of the puzzles. Now there's plenty of puzzles in the game that you do require to use this effect, which will like change the way the world looks a little bit. So you could do like a jumping puzzle or something like that. But it's also an attack. It does pretty okay AoE damage. There are certain builds like say the Gardener's Masks, for example, that will give you some health back when you hit enemies with the Adua Burst. The AoE is fantastic as well for scenarios where there's lots of enemies, but also it will stagger enemies like trash enemies that you fight, not so much bosses, but the general enemies you fight, especially the ones that have like these really long and annoying attack combos. You can stagger them out of that with the Adua Burst. So make sure you're leaning into this as well and using it as an attack, as it is a free attack that you can use to get some free magic damage off. The mask lines are something that I also ignored and shouldn't have. Now these are your spells, and I didn't totally understand which ones were good or like how to use them. I did cover the one that I've used the most in yesterday's video, but that's the Coastal Harpoon to one-shot range enemies. Absolutely fantastic. But you will unlock a ton of these by exploring and defeating enemies. Now, for the most part, their base level here when you get them is just kind of like okay. They only become more valuable and actually like relatively usable when you have leveled them up. Now you can do this at any of the smithing anvils that you do see around the world. You'll be able to like level these up there, and would highly recommend to level up the ones that you want to use, as for the most part that base level just isn't super valuable. It doesn't do enough damage or like is a strong enough effect that you can use this over just say, you know, deflecting or attacking normally. But once you have leveled them up, they do become quite strong. So find ones that you do like. You will get plenty of the materials to level these up, so definitely lean into that because you can have so many of these equipped with all of your loadouts. And lastly, the best masks that you find, like your armor, typically come from farming them, not from your critical path. So on the critical path, you will get a few masks. You only start out with a couple, but the best ones actually come from farming some of those trash enemies. You'll often see with certain enemies that when you defeat them, you'll get mask shards. Now you need a certain amount of these mask shards, which you can actually see in your key items by going into your inventory and checking that item, and it'll say how many you've got and then a total amount. That total amount is how many you need to farm in order to get it. There are plenty of these in the second map area of the game that you'll be able to get that are quite powerful and valuable and well worth investing in. And there are also some that come from NPC quest lines, like the Zealot's Mask. In order to get this, you will need to defeat the creature in the Colosseum and then talk to him while wearing that mask, and he will give you the Zealot's Mask, which is actually quite powerful, as well as it will save you if you do take damage that'll eventually kill you. It'll actually save you from that first initial hit. So really good for like hard bosses or hard encounters that maybe you're struggling with, but there's plenty of these masks that you'll be able to get that are actually quite powerful. But let me know in the comments what mask you are using, and thank you guys for watching this video till the end. Thank you to our members for supporting the channel. My name is Norza, and I hope you have a great day.